Good evening and welcome to a special edition of The World Today, brought to you from a trade union hall in central London, where people are beginning to gather for an emergency solidarity meeting with Venezuela, organized by the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. The coup carried out by the United States in league with their assets in Venezuela and the rest of the continent, as well as allies in the European Union, is so blatant, is so open, that it beggars the imagination. Juan Guaido, unknown to anyone in the rest of the world, unknown to most Venezuelans, declared himself as President of the National Assembly the new president of Venezuela, citing a clause in the Venezuelan constitution which he deliberately and illegally misrepresented. This has been accepted by the mainstream press, no surprises there, and has been accepted by many of the countries of the European Union, with the exception of the Greek government of Tsipras.
The EU reiterates its full support to the National Assembly, which is the democratic, legitimate body of Venezuela, and whose powers need to be restored and respected, including the prerogatives and safety of its members.
But by and large, the green light has been given to the United States yet again to go and topple a regime, to organize regime change.
This is no time for dialogue. This is time for action.
The message this meeting is sending out is a message of solidarity from Britain, hurriedly organized to show people in Venezuela that we understand the problems that they face, social and economic, that we are in complete sympathy with them, but we are totally opposed to this attempt to violate Venezuelan sovereignty and to topple an elected government. The change of government is a task of the Venezuelan people themselves. And this meeting being held tonight, in which, amongst others, I will be participating, is designed to send a message of support and to try and break the isolation of Venezuela as best we can.
Trade unionists recognise what a democratically elected leader is, and it isn't someone who just declares themselves the president of a country. What they won't want in Venezuela, in the unions, in common with teacher trade unions and other trade unionists across Latin America and globally, is external military intervention and indeed malicious meddling from Trump and his friend in the region, Bolsonaro. Our own government, well, of course, not your government, not my government, but the British government, needs to think carefully about the record of the US. It's not been a helpful and positive record, has it? We know, however, that what has happened recently is that a UN rapporteur visiting Venezuela for the first time in 21 years found that US sanctions are illegal and could amount to crimes against humanity, and they're certainly against international law, and he described them as hurting the economy of Venezuela and killing Venezuelans. Now, if the UN is saying that, then that should have given the British government, the Canadian government, and all of those other governments who have rushed to recognise Guaido, should have given them pause for thought and should really have made them take a different approach. I believe that there are enough people of goodwill in this country that we really can make our voices heard. We won't hear them on the BBC, we won't hear them in the mainstream media, but we are lucky that we have Telesur, we have Alborada, there are other sources of news and information. You know, American politicians have said of what's happening in Venezuela. If Venezuela were rich in carrots, we wouldn't care what kind of government they had. It's because it's rich in oil that they care what kind of government it has. So thank you very much for being here. No blood for oil, solidarity.
I'd like to say that, yes, I was elected last summer onto the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, and what inspired me to join the Labour Party was because of that new direction of politics that the party was taking. And if you were to sum up what that new direction of politics would be this: no more war. It would be no more war around the world, but particularly now in Venezuela. The acute economic difficulties Venezuela has experienced in the last few years are nothing new or unique in their fundamental cause. Indeed, they are little different from the decades of neoliberal crisis that was a constant feature of Venezuela in the 80s and 90s, where a self-serving elite protected themselves whilst passing the costs on to the poor. But this crisis is unlike previous experiences in one very, very important way. US imperialism has long seen Venezuela as the new Cuba, and an existential crisis to their assumed right to dominate and terrorize sovereign nations in its backyard, as was mentioned, whose defiance is an insult and an embarrassment to their power. Finally, this month, the long-anticipated coup d'etat was attempted, but has been faced with determined resistance from the Chavista movement, people who are well-educated about what the reality of US intervention means and are defiant in its face. Nicolas Maduro warns the US to avoid another Vietnam, and we in the British Labour movement say the same to Donald Trump and his ally Theresa May: no more Vietnams, and whilst they're at it, no more Iraqs or Libya either. And did I mention that Venezuela has one of the largest proven oil reserves, much like Iraq or Libya, and look what happened there. It just will keep on happening, will it not, until we stand up and we say no more. So, who are these saviours of democracy we keep hearing about, waiting in the wings to rescue Venezuela? Juan Guaido, presented to the world as a media-friendly, moderate, even social democrat figure, has previous to now had almost no name recognition in Venezuela. What little he has stemmed from his involvement in groups closely associated with gruesome acts of deadly street violence, all in the name of unconstitutional removal from office of the elected government. So who is behind the rise of this obscure and punitive president? Some clue might be found in Donald Trump's appointment of Elliot Abrams, as has also been previously mentioned, who is now special envoy to Venezuela. There are very few monsters whose career in American government rival that of Elliot Abrams. Abrams made a name for himself in the Reagan administration, backing death squads in Latin America that murdered thousands for right-wing dictators. We must reject these people, their imperialist tactics, and their allies in our own country outright. And we should all campaign relentlessly for a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government that will do the same. No to intervention, no to imperialism, yes to peace, dialogue, and socialism. Thank you.
Friends, we are gathered here at difficult times because the outcome in Caracas is still not clear. Let's be frank. Very few people know which way this coup by the United States is going to go, how they will react if the elected government hangs on to power, and how they will, whether they have a plan B for toppling it, because plan A has been exposed before the world for what it is. Blatant, so blatant and crude that it beggars the imagination that anyone watching the BBC or reading The Guardian or any other newspaper can take this seriously. But what has been happening in South America, the change in US imperial strategy, is this: that whereas in the past they would simply organize a military coup and that would be it, topple the regime of Salvador Allende in Chile, the socialist regime imposed Pinochet, killed 20,000 or so people, kill intellectuals, let the people who can escape go into exile, they didn't care. They did the same in Brazil, they did the same in Bolivia, they did the same in Panama, they did it in many other places. This is not too popular these days and a bit difficult to defend. So what they're going for now, effectively, if you look at how they've been operating since the victory of Hugo Chavez in the last year of the previous century, is to work by utilizing, corrupting, debasing the actually existing institutions of democracy in all these countries and use them to try and topple governments. They did it in Paraguay, they did it in Honduras, and we know the impact this has had on the population in Honduras, the numbers of activists and ordinary people who have been killed. They did it over a 2.5-year period, more or less, in Brazil. The imprisonment of Lula, the coup, constitutional coup against Dilma, the street mobilizations carried out by the Brazilian far right, the refusal to release Lula from prison or to permit Lula, the most popular politician in the country, from contesting the elections. The Brazilian story, of course, is a huge defeat for the left and for the working class movement in Brazil. The Workers' Party was the last big social democratic workers' party to be built in the world. This party has more or less been destroyed. So in the face of this, so we have to see what is happening in Venezuela in the light of all this. In Mexico, they rigged the last 2 elections to prevent López Obrador's victory. This election was impossible to rig because the anger of the people had built up to such an extent that they poured out to make sure that López Obrador had a majority on every single institution that exists in that country. Parliamentary, and his own victory was huge, just to make sure it was not going to be easy, that no rigging could take place. So that's been one victory that we have won. But by and large, the United States has been successful in institutional coups against the countries I've mentioned. Tragically, the government of Ecuador under Moreno was simply bought off. I mean, it's corruption on a mega scale, and not the entire story hasn't yet come out on how they did it, how they maneuvered, the institutions they used, but it's a terrible story. And they do it because they think it's more successful. And people in this country should know that the campaigns they wage, the media campaigns, the so-called Human Rights Watch campaigns, are all now part and parcel of what they do. I mean, we have had a small example of it in the campaign waged against Jeremy Corbyn by the British media. Think about it, it is an astonishing campaign against a leader of the opposition in this country who has been elected and re-elected by his own party, which is now one of the largest mass parties in Europe as a result of these campaigns. And yet they go on and on and on. He's a friend of Chavez. A BBC showed a documentary not so long ago attempting to tarnish the reputation of Chavez, and of course a picture of Corbyn with Venezuelan leaders. So it goes on non-stop. And against this we fight as best we do, you know, with our pens, with our voices, with our solidarity. But it's important to understand why they are doing it. And the reason why they're doing it is because we live in a world where they can no longer accept, and haven't been able to accept, any challenge to the imperial system. from anywhere. They thought with the collapse of the Soviet Union and that whole world order, they would be able to have it their own way always. And when they can't have it because new movements arise, like the Bolivarians were one such movement, and they assert two things. What I would describe these governments as, none of them has been, strictly speaking, a revolutionary government on the style of the 20th century. Most of them have been elected governments and elected left social democratic governments, radical social democrats with a mass base which mobilizes. That is what these regimes have been. But one thing they have imposed their control on is how their own resources are used. And Venezuela was a big, big example for that, not just in South America, but all over the world. For working people, for trade unions, saying that these things could still happen, that these things could be done. And they wanted to destroy this example. And of course, linked to that was Hugo Chávez's assertion in a very bold, brash even, courageous way of Venezuelan sovereignty. He told me once that after he'd attacked Bush directly at a meeting of the United Nations Assembly, how large numbers of Arab leaders and others came to him privately, shook his hands and thanked him because they couldn't do it. And so this attempt to assert national sovereignty has been extremely important. And those who, in the name of a so-called cosmopolitanism, want to say that we should completely ignore sovereignty are crazy, because that is caving into the global social order. That is the argument they used. They do not like nation states because nation states still can exercise, where they exist, a certain degree of sovereignty, which prevents them from pushing all their plans through. So in South America, they just want to just get rid of regimes which challenge them. I mean, people who talk about the neutrality of the American mass media, Bill Maher, you know, a popular sort of semi-comedian in more senses than one, who has a chat show, declared, yeah, we were right in Venezuela, why the hell shouldn't we take back our own backyard? This is the mentality of quite a lot of people there, regardless of whether they're Trump supporters or Democrats. I mean, the coup in Honduras was organized by Obama and Hillary Clinton. Trump carries on in his own weird way, and appoints sort of even worse people, like the appointment of Elliot Abrams, a convicted criminal, to be in charge of Venezuela is actually quite apt, because only criminals can run this country for the United States. They've done it before in Nicaragua, in the Contra War. They've done it even prior to that in backing Pinochet in Chile. So why not try and create an ultra-right-wing regime in Venezuela, get your companies to take the oil, neoliberalize the country, and that is what is known as order and stability. What the Bolivarians did in South America, which annoyed the United States a great deal and angered them, was to create an alternative. Economically, left social democracy, politically anti-imperialist, global, and the aid given by Chavez when he was alive to the Bolivians, to the Ecuadorians, to others who were in need of it, was quite astonishing. Acts of true internationalism, saying we can work together, we can create something different. Alas, it was not to be. His own tragic death created a crisis, which we see is still going on in many ways. And then the United States were proactive during the Chavez years. We live in a world where history, especially in the media and television networks, is totally ignored. But let's not forget the 3 attempts made to get rid of Hugo Chavez, who was elected with huge majorities. A coup organized by the army, defeated by rank-and-file soldiers, and huge mass mobilizations in Venezuela. The poor came out to defend the government, defeated that coup. And the most symbolic event of that 2 weeks was when the general came out to order the band to play the national anthem, a 16-year-old peasant lad from an ultra-poor family refused to play the trumpet. Some of you will remember that, and the general said, "I'm ordering you to play the trumpet." He said it 3 times. And on the 3rd time, the trumpeter said, "General, you seem very keen that someone should play the trumpet. Here, have a go yourself." That was the spirit of resistance in Venezuela at that time. And it was impossible to carry the coup through. And Chavez came back, again won elections after that, but they didn't try anything too serious on having failed this time and through other means that they used. Maduro came to power at a time when the economic situation was difficult. And look, for those of us in real solidarity, meaningful solidarity with the Venezuelans at this time and their elected government, we have to say, acknowledge to ourselves, mistakes were made. Mistakes were made on the economy, which are now recognized by most people. But that is not the reason Maduro is being toppled by the United States, because he made mistakes in the economy. Even though Maduro's vote is on a par with the votes received by Macron and many other European leaders in Europe today, they are on a par with that. But what we do know is that the economic crisis in Venezuela undoubtedly played its part in destabilizing the regime, and this economic crisis, which possibly the regime could have been managed had the United States not imposed sanctions. And that is the other mechanism that is used against governments they don't like. Impose sanctions. You don't like Putin, impose sanctions on Russia. You don't like the regime in Iran, impose sanctions. So here you have the global economic order totally under the control of global institutions that themselves are determined, their cadres, their personnel are determined, nominated by the United States of America. Not a single major figure from the Democrats in the United States has attacked what was done to Chavez, because they had been trying to do it before. And before them, Bush. And before him, God knows who else. It's something that's been going on for years. The only thing that changes is the method. So from here, what we do is what we are doing. We tell the truth. We fight back. We support organizations like Venezuela Solidarity. And we use the social networks as best we can to spread the truth. Because that is the one thing we will never get unless there's a change, a meaningful radical change, which we might get with a new Labour government. So let's hope, friends, because one act of solidarity that we could do concretely in this country is, of course, elect Jeremy Corbyn and send him to Downing Street.
Now, it's fashionable, I hear, when you get on a platform to appoint yourself without a mandate to high office, even to be a president. So I thought I'd appoint myself as an official returning officer of a number of international elections. So here's the results. The first figure I'll give you is for the percentage of votes cast. The second figure is the percentage of the registered votes. So Donald Trump, 46% and 27%. Theresa May, 42.3% and 29%. Sanchez in Spain, 22.6% and 15%. Macron in France, 24% and 11.69%. Nicolas Maduro, 67.84% and 31.7%. And a late result has just come in. Juan Guaido, 0% and 0%. Maduro was elected through one of the most advanced and closely observed electoral processes in the world. The British Foreign Secretary said he thought there'd been tampering with ballot papers in Venezuela, which is really interesting because they don't use them. It's a fully automated, fingerprint-based system, audited publicly on the National Election Council's TV station before, during and after the voting. And the electoral process was observed by 150 people, including 14 electoral commissions from 8 countries and 2 technical commissions, 18 journalists and many others, and no complaints were received. Maduro got 6.3 million votes. The nearest of his other 4 rivals, Henri Falcon, got 1.9 million. Maduro is the legitimate, democratically elected president of Venezuela.
Venezuela has always been the prize for the US establishment. Venezuela, a cornerstone of the alliance of those Latin American countries that are attempting to unshackle themselves from US domination. Quite a simple quest, but one fraught with danger. It's Venezuela that gave a lesson to other countries in Latin America on how you could challenge the power of the ruling elites in their own countries. Now, we now find that Venezuela is in the crosshairs of the US empire and Donald Trump. And how should we react? And I want to really say this in a conversational sense, because I'm having debates and discussions with people who I thought would be automatically with us. And if we're honest, it's really, really difficult at the moment, and we shouldn't underestimate that. Venezuela is not perfect. Mistakes have been made, and honest criticisms by friends of the Bolivarian Revolution are absolutely legitimate in private, not in public. Okay? I lived through the miners' strike of 84-85, and I remember people bleating to me, the miners should have had a ballot in Nottinghamshire. Well, when the struggle comes, you make a choice. It's one side or the other. And we made that choice then. But some of us are old enough to remember Chile 1973. And we remember the phrases the Americans used then, that they would make the Chilean economy squeal in their efforts to overthrow the left in Chile. I remember the murder of people like us in this room, okay? That's a chilling fact. That's what's going to happen in Venezuela. And I remember political refugees coming to my city. And I remember the boost of neoliberalism around the world. And I'll leave you with 2 comments, if you have any doubts about the situation. First of all, John Bolton, that historic walrus that strides across the TV screens. On Fox Business News, January the 28th, we are in conversations with major American companies right now. It would make a difference if we could have American companies produce the oil in Venezuela. It would be good for Venezuela and the USA. The second piece of information, the poll that we've referred to. 86% of Venezuelan people oppose military intervention. 81% are against US sanctions. Our demand is quite simple. The fate of Venezuela should be decided by the Venezuelan people, not Donald Trump. My final comment, because I know this is a difficult situation, is this. Remember the words of Martin Luther King. At the end of the day, it's not the words of our enemies we remember, it's the silence of our friends. We cannot afford to be silent, comrades. Thank you.
No war on Venezuela.
No war on Venezuela.
Thank you.